Hi, I'm Cami.
Hi, I'm Taylor.
Hi, I'm Marlo.
And we're the Brisbane MediaMap archiving team. Today we're going to be talking to our special guests, Stephen Harrington, Benjamin Nicol, Callum McWaters and Marcus Foth. And we're going to be celebrating the history of the Brisbane MediaMap.
We hope you enjoy.
So my name is Marcus Foth. I'm now a professor in the School of Design. At the time that I joined QUT in 2001, I was a master's student doing a MA in digital media, so I was actually in media communications. And so I had exposure to a lot of the lecturers and some of the classes that were taught at the time, and the Brisbane MediaMap was one of them. Now, the other thing that happened around that time is that web development and web design was just very high in demand, and especially people with our skills. And so I had just completed a bachelor degree at Griffith in multimedia design. So I knew how to do websites and coding, and so I had a lot of extra work that lecturers in media comms offered in order to get websites done for classes and stuff. And so Brisbane MediaMap was one of them. So I started working on this in 2002. So I became a tutor working with Chris Spurgeon. And so my first involvement with the Brisbane MediaMap was version 3.
So my name is Callum McWaters. I was a student in Brisbane MediaMap in 2012. And then this year, since I graduated my PhD, which I also did here, I've been a tutor in the unit in semester 1 and 2.
My name is Ben Nicol. I'm a lecturer in digital media in the School of Communication here at QUT, and I started actually at the beginning of the year, and I guess I was kind of brought on as caretaker for the unit, given that this is the final year that it's being run, but I think we still managed to make a few really positive changes in the final year of the unit.
So my name's Stephen Harrington. I'm an associate professor in School of Communication. I'm going to slightly embarrass myself and reveal my age and also Marcus's age, because Marcus was my tutor in Brisbane MediaMap as I was an undergraduate student, my first contact. That was in 2003. I then went on to do a PhD, and while I was doing my PhD I was a tutor in the unit myself for 2 years, in 2005 and 2006. And then I took over coordination duties of it when I started my ongoing position here in 2008. I think I coordinated for about 5 years, I can't quite remember. And my role in that time was actually seeing quite a lot of change. Basically as it transitioned from a sort of standalone unit that was quite well defined to something that connected with other projects as well. So.
So I never actually coordinated the unit. I was just lending assistance with regards to the technical development. And so I think Chris Spurgeon and I had a bit of an aspiration around bringing more an understanding of web design, like not necessarily making every single media communication studies student a HTML programmer, but at least having a good understanding so that you could talk to someone in that area. And so the classes from then onwards had at least one lecture more on the background of how the MediaMap website actually works. And at the same time, the other aspiration, I suppose, starting around that time, is that we had the very first one in 2000 was a statically programmed website, just static HTML. The second version in 2001 was an ASP-driven site, which is a different database language. And then from then onwards, we used a scripting language called PHP, which is still quite common today. A lot of WordPress sites use PHP. And so that aspiration was around scalability, because before the bottleneck really was the manual labor involved in handcrafting every single page and writing it and so forth. Whereas if you have a database, you can actually use a interface to get people to input data, and you have a separation of the web design from the web content. So we could get all the students to focus on researching entries for the Brisbane MediaMap, updating entries in the future, and pretty much having them concentrate on what they really focus on in their degree program. Whereas we just focused on making sure that it had a nice look and feel, and it was accessible and so forth.
So I also haven't been a unit coordinator, just only a tutor, but I think in the limited time that I had and the limited resources that I had, what I really wanted to do was try and connect the project back to those really big ideas of what is the media and what is the media like in Brisbane, and see if there were some really simple things that I could do to try and help make that happen. Because I think one of the really great things about the unit when I did it as a student was that, you know, I was inputting stuff into the database and I was making decisions like with my student colleagues about what was the media and what was appropriate to put in the database and therefore the website. So for me, just trying to connect it back to those big theoretical and practical issues about what is the media.
Yeah, for me, I think a big challenge for me was like just figuring out what the unit was, because I started here at the beginning of the year and was given that unit to teach, and I was coming from the University of Melbourne, which is, you know, a very traditional institution with a very traditional approach to teaching, and, you know, it's just lecture tutorial format for all of the units I had ever taught. So Brisbane MediaMap was really unorthodox as far as my own experience went. So that was a big thing, is just figuring out how to run the unit. But I think one thing I realized after I had read some of the essays from students in prior iterations of the unit is that at some point it kind of transitioned from, I guess, a focus on those technical skills, coding and so on, to interdisciplinary collaboration, sort of sorting students into teams and trying to emulate a professional environment. And I think somewhere along the line, it just started to become the case that students felt they were working in silos, so they would kind of do the work in their teams and not really communicate with each other. So one thing I think I just tried to do this year was to facilitate more of a collaborative environment, and part of that meant giving more of a prominent role to the internal communications team, which is most of you guys here. So I think we definitely were successful in that, making it more of a collaborative exercise.
I don't know if this actually answers the question, but probably my number one thing in terms of how I managed the unit and my approach to managing the unit was always, I wanted to have as little involvement as possible, and that's not as a result of laziness, although I tend to be. It is actually because I wanted it from the get-go to be a student project, one that students did. I would be, you know, assisting when it came to you know, seeing how that project or that work would articulate with assessment, for example. But so often, particularly early on in the semester, once students started, you know, working on the project, they would sort of come to me all the time and ask me to like help them deal with a problem that they just assumed that I would have all the answers, and I was like, I don't have the answers. You have to come up with the answers yourselves, and that was a really big mind shift for a lot of students. Yeah. And the thing that's really great is that it would so often surprise me as to who would do well in the unit as well. Like sometimes you would see a student who you'd come across in, you know, previous classes, you know, first and second year, they weren't necessarily all that, you know, enthusiastic about stuff. But then when given this sort of opportunity to do something that is, you know, original, a bit different, lead a team perhaps, suddenly they would really step up and really be some of the most engaged students. And some of the people who perhaps did really well in a highly scaffolded environment when it was like write an essay on this topic, etc., would sometimes also have a little bit more difficulty than perhaps they anticipated. And it was really nice to see how people actually performed in a slightly different environment. But the approach was actually, you know, the point of the unit is to replicate what a real-world project is like, and real-world projects are messy, it's confusing, you don't know who's in charge, you have, you know, miscommunication. Sometimes a task gets completely lost between two different teams, or two different teams do the same thing and then they talk to each other and go, oh no, we've doubled up. Those things, people always used to see them as failures, and I would always say, no, that is actual preparation for how you would deal with stuff in the real world. That in itself is probably the biggest learning outcome that I try to emphasize to students, that don't see that as failure, see that as learning experience, because even in very well managed organizations, it's difficult to get things absolutely right between teams, especially in short-term creative projects.
Can I add one more thought? Because
Yeah.
Ben mentioning the unorthodoxy of the Brisbane Media Lab, especially in the early days, which reminded me that at the time that we started, well, especially the early days, it was actually seen as quite innovative. So when we spoke about this whole approach towards learning and teaching through the Brisbane Media Map, a lot of colleagues at other universities across Australia would say, "Oh, this is really cool. We want that as well." So the other aspiration on that time was world domination, like totally. And we were successful with at least two. So we created a template. It was called the Universal Media Map. And we had two instances. One was in Sweden, so we had a Malmö media map that we exported to colleagues in Malmö in Sweden, and another one in Melbourne at La Trobe. So those colleagues actually started to adopt the format and the curriculum and so forth, but then the students worked obviously on localized versions. I don't actually know what happened to those instances and those units, but for a number of years we had a number of those, and there were even discussions around a federated system, which means that you would have different cities in Australia with students doing the mapping, but then there would be a way to analyze entries across multiple cities, for instance, and then do comparative analysis. So there was, big aspirations around that.
I was at one stage mere days away from hopping on a plane to Brunei to explore this to university. Didn't happen at the last moment. It got cancelled, but it was.
We did publish papers with some of the co-authors. So there's some papers published with colleagues in Sweden that describe the pedagogy around the Brisbane Media Map.
In some ways, like methodologically, pedagogically, how the unit was structured, it kind of almost anticipated what I guess would later be called convergence culture. Like Henry Jenkins published that book in like 2006 or something. But I guess what students were doing in Brisbane Media Map quite early on is pulling together content, converging content, and also it's, by the sounds of it, kind of a platformization mentality as well. Like we want to create a kind of centralized place where traffic can all converge and look at all this information at once. So it was ahead of the curve for sure, I think, in that sense.
This is going to answer the question in a roundabout way. One of the things I think it was in 2009. I had this realization that it was running too well. So in 2009, I said, actually, we've got a problem here, which is that it's been running for at that stage it would have been 9 years, and every year the process of how it worked was improved, and documentation for what happened the previous year was improved, and lots of stuff. So at that point, what actually happened was it ran too well. It was too smooth. It was just like, okay, hand this off to this team, and then it was everyone was like, okay, you're going to write the entries, and it was way too straightforward. And I actually think that one of the things that makes this unit very good, I was coming back to what I was saying before, is in fact that slight chaos that needs to be in there. And if things are too well defined, that actually limits the creativity of the student group. So I think it works best if it is slightly grey or amorphous in terms of what the outcome can or should be. I don't think it should just be, all right, you just need to do this, but the next version. That's certainly the way I would think about any future iterations of whatever this project will become in the future.
Yeah, I think Callum and I definitely, that rings true for us. Like in first semester when we wrote it earlier this year, the students kind of approached us in the first few weeks and were like, we want to scrap the project. And at first, starting here, I was like, whoa, I don't know if we should do that, but we decided to let them go for it. But I think it did sort of galvanize the students and created this momentum. So I think that was a really good observation.
And behind the scenes teaching, there's always a lot of stuff that changes before the semester starts. And so, yes, every unit, particularly in media where things are changing a lot, we're always developing units and changing units, and it's just something that needs to happen. With this unit, I agree with the previous comments. There always is a little bit, an element of chaos, and you kind of have to, I felt that, semester 1, semester 2, we actually had to push students to try and think outside of the box, because it is really just easy to rebrand the website and do what was done last semester incrementally better. And so there's that, okay, we can do that, but we should do something different, we should do something better, we should do something bigger, we should change it somehow. So that's a challenge.
I'm not sure what the real requirements or expectations are around a capstone unit in media comms, but I do recall around the early days that you mentioned that you guys have this aspiration to create a legacy, and I think that still actually occurred even in the early days, because the legacy was actually in the pragmatics of having a directory that was handmade and hand curated by the previous generation of students, that are in a way leaving that as a legacy for the year 2 students, or like the next generation, for the purpose of looking at identifying opportunities for internships, workplace integrated learning, where to actually apply for a job. And so this whole sense-making kind of exercise in the Brisbane MediaMap unit wasn't just to kind of create a website, but it was also of great utility for the students themselves, because they were about to enter the workforce, as well as a resource and directory for other QUT students or other students in Brisbane, because it was very hand curated and it got you the opportunity to actually just email people. Because you could say, I'm a student at QUT, I'm working on this unit, we're updating your entry, and so even if you send it to info@mediacompany.com somewhere in the valley or in the city or whatever, it gave you an excuse to get in touch with all these different records and the companies that are described in the record. And so then, whoever answered the email would say, I can't do that, I have to put you in touch with the owner, the CEO, So students actually got in touch and interviewed quite senior people in the media industry and media landscape for updating these entries. And I think that enabled a lot of the connections to be made at the right moment. So I think that is another aspect of it being like a capstone unit that was really useful.
Yeah, it's funny, you saying that also makes me think about how there was a period where we started to think, well, actually, what's the value anymore? Google exists now. What's the point? And it was always remarkable, because then every year students would then be getting in touch with these companies, and they'd be like, oh yeah, we love the Brisbane MediaMap, it's always good. And in a lot of instances, I would then be getting, because my name was, my email address was listed somewhere on the website, I'd get emails, through the year saying, oh, I want to get in touch with someone about updating our entry because, our details have changed. And that was always this really nice reminder that actually people were looking at it, and it did have, an impact among the local industry.
I do, yes, because I still feel that question of what is the media is shifting. For quite a lot of people it's settled, for quite a lot of academics and theorists it's not settled. So I do think there is a need to engage in those taxonomy debates. And that's what I did as a student in the unit. And I think they're very useful and very interesting. Like, for example, Facebook, these social media platforms, are they media? That's a current debate that's happening, and that's something a debate that we could link with in the unit now that we're not at the moment. So I think yes.
I would say yes, but there's lots of different ways it can be done. It doesn't have to be done in the kind of form of a directory, I suppose. Not that it was a directory, but in that purely informational sense, as you say, you can engage in a bit more theoretical and speculative, notional mapping of the media. I think that is really important, especially because one of the as you say, one of the most fundamental questions that media scholars, media industry workers, etc., are grappling with is okay, how do we think about Facebook? Do we think about it as a local company? Do we think about it as an international company? How is it governed? How is it, who's responsible for what is seen on Facebook, etc. Those are still just fundamental questions, and that is a huge part of those questions come down to questions of space and place, and so mapping is important. This is a really generic answer, but I think that the local, to think about a local media scene, I think it's going to be more and more sort of boutique experiences for people. We'll have the increasingly kind of global dominance by the huge media organisations, the big 4 or 5, whatever you want to define them. But that there will be a place, I think, for local experience and local knowledge that will find a way, and I think will increasingly attract a premium. And I think more and more we've seen this in the last 10 or 15 years anyway, but more and more it's more and more about experiences rather than just content. So finding ways of creating an experience for people will always be useful and something you can't really pay through a screen.
I always want to dodge out of this question because I really lived in Brisbane for like 6 or 7 months, so I don't feel like I have a great understanding of the makeup of the industry here. But sorry, actually I don't really have much to add, except that, there are big changes on the horizon, I think, as well. I think, Stephen, you mentioned like the big 4 or 5, say, media organisations that we would think about that are dominant today, and perhaps the ones that would come to mind are your Facebooks and Googles and maybe if it actually survives. But there are lots of Chinese media companies as well. Like, I research the game industry, and Tencent is like a really big thing that people are talking about a lot now, and they are leading a massive acquisition-led expansion strategy where they're buying up a lot of overseas companies, including in Australia. And that's just the video game industry, but I just, that's a very interesting time to be in. And there are those companies like Alibaba as well that are kind of on the rise, and WeChat. And I think a lot of the Western media platforms and companies are kind of looking to those Chinese examples and thinking about how they might emulate them. Anyway, that was just something that came into my head, something that might be on the horizon as we move forward.
Yeah, I've got a lot of things to say. I don't know how coherent I can be. My PhD, a part of my PhD, was the trident methodology that Marcus was talking about earlier by Cunningham and Higgs. So I have a little bit of an understanding of what the media industry is like in Brisbane for workers, according to the last census data, 2016 census data. And as Marcus said, and as the trident methodology work kind of revealed, a lot of media workers are embedded in other industries. That's obvious when you think about it logically, because every company needs a media or marketing person. And over the past 10 or 20 years, there's been a massive culturalization, whereas organizations needed to get a website, they needed to get on social media because those things were new. And so we've had this massive explosion of marketing and communication and media and advertising. But I know the question that I kind of have, is there still going to be that need going forward with social media and websites becoming so easier and really everyday technology and stuff? And as a young person, I feel like a lot of my peers and media communication graduates go into these industries and they kind of get pigeonholed as the young person that can do the social media, and it's kind of like, well, what about when that person wants to move into the middle of their career, and when they become a senior, what kind of roles are there for those people? So that's something that I'm interested in, and that's something that I think people my age should be thinking about.
We're just in 5-10 years time, and social media has completely changed anyway. Who knows what will be around or what it will look like.
And so to go back to the original question, I think a lot of graduates need to be also quite skilled with media and marketing and professionals, comms professionals, but they also need to have knowledge of other industries that they want to go into as well, because they're going to be working, as a media person in a different industry, whether it's mining or agriculture or something else, banking, finance, etc. So it's really about having interdisciplinary skills, which is something that Brisbane MediaMap sets you up well for.
I think there's going to be a lot of convergence and scale making, as was already alluded to with regards to the media platforms, and that might have a footprint in Brisbane as well. But I think in addition to that, there's also new fields that are actually opening up. another piece we've been working on is looking at the kind of privacy concerns and the way that data has been captured by smart city technology. So we've been, looking at the Alphabet Sidewalk Labs development in Toronto waterfront, which on the one hand you could say that's just like a technical development, and there's a lot of data being harvested about what people are doing. But what strikes me about this is, and the way that we've been problematizing it, is that the engineers, the designers, the computer scientists, the data scientists, the urban scientists, like all of that kind of field, is in desperate need of people with media communication study skills. And so similarly, if you kind of translate this to Brisbane wanting to be a new world city and a smart city and so forth, they need kind of our graduates to talk some sense into this big array of obsessing about the utopian visions that this technology might bring about, because it's not very well tempered and balanced around privacy concerns, around the top-down versus the bottom-up versus other kinds of ethical usages. And so a lot of stuff we've been there before, but for them it's like brand new field. And so I think if we had more interdisciplinary kinds of skill sets in such developments, I think in a way my answer to your question is yes, there's going to be very exciting things happening in the media industry, but what we call right now the media industry still has a start and an end, and there's lots of exciting opportunities for people with these skill sets outside that field as well, which goes back to the embeddedness. So not just where they're currently embedded, but actually being frontiers and pioneers and looking at these developments and saying, actually, I got something to contribute to these discussions. And in fact, sometimes I add people on LinkedIn and I look at their profile, and then at the very end it says education, Bachelor of Communications or Bachelor of Media. And so I find it quite interesting how often that occurs, and those are usually the people that are talking a lot of sense in projects, in committees and boardrooms.
And I think that comes back to, in a media studies degree, studying comms, you should get that critical foundation too. And I think that we have preserved that with Brisbane MediaMap as well, where you come away with with a critical understanding of the media and an understanding that some of the problems that we're having now are problems that have been addressed, in different guises over the last however many years. So I think that is very important to continue to uphold as we move forward as well. Just understanding why being critical of the media is also important.
And keep watching Media Watch.
Yeah, exactly.